The best creative ideas happen with other people. There's this really interesting story about Google. So basically the way it worked at Google is 80% of your time was focused on primary things and 20% was on experimentation. I think the best creators have this belief about experimentation and always taking what they have and creating something new from it. It's a sort of cycle of creative destruction. There's this really interesting story about Google, and Google is an interesting company because very early on they discovered probably one of the best businesses ever, which is ads, right? And so they had insane PMF, they could really scale. And then as they were growing, they were facing this issue where they're like, okay, we have all these crazy ideas. Do we work on what's working or do we do these crazy ideas? And the staff, I think, was kind of all over the place. And it wasn't until Eric Schmidt, I think, instituted this thing called 20% time, right? So basically the way it worked at Google is 80% of your time was focused on primary things and 20% was on experimentation and new things. And that led to a lot of their big products. And so I think for any creator, it's so important to keep have your core, but not get too bogged down by it, right? There's a really interesting thing, and if you look at actually authors, let's say someone has a successful book for morning rituals, right? They can either now write their next thing, or what they do is they do morning rituals for real estate, morning rituals for podcasters, morning rituals for XYZ, right? And so it's are you just going to take the thing that's working and just squeeze the entire juice out of it? Or do you experiment with it and create something new? And I think the best creators have this belief about experimentation and always taking what they have and creating something new from it. It's a sort of cycle of creative destruction. Something I've actually struggled with as a creator a lot is this idea of perfection, right? When you sit down to write or when you sit down to draw or record music, it has to be perfect from the first go. And so many artists just don't even start because of that. And I actually have to credit Julian, I think his website's julian.com, where he did this really interesting post where he was comparing artists like Ed Sheeran and another who was famous artist. And they had this concept where think of creativity as pipes. So it's like plumbing or pipes in your home, and it's jammed up. And so when you sit down to write or draw or whatever, you really both literally and figuratively have to get the shit out, all the crap stuff out, right? And that's the first draft. Then you start building on it. So there's this interesting story where there was a classroom and they were basically split into two groups, right? And one group was told, make the perfect pot. And the other group was told, make as many pots as possible. And guess what? At the end of the group, which group had the best pots? It was the group that was actually told to make the most pots because they were constantly refining and constantly learning and constantly doing more as they were doing more and more pots, creating more and more, right? And so the first draft is never the best. It's usually closest to what the ideal would be, but it's not the thing which is the ideal. As a creator, right? You have this vision in your head, and the first thing you create is never going to be close to that. And so many people just stop themselves right there, and nothing happens, right? And the best creators, they know that first draft isn't close to the ideal. They keep refining it so that they can get to the ideal. And if you look at the world, there's a graveyard of creative ideas that got stopped at the first draft because someone didn't like what they made. And I think that's a disservice to the world. I remember I interviewed this marketer and author, Philip Stutz, and he had this really cool way of resolving problems. A lot of times, when we're dealing with an issue, whether it's interpersonal or business or whatever, right? It's all in our head. We're just constantly kind of going over and over and ruminating on it. Or maybe I just do that and other people don't, but I think other people do too. He came up with the idea of a 60-minute journal, which is a great way to just externalize what you're feeling and thinking. The reason you do 60 minutes is the first 40 minutes is usually really crap. It's that thing of cleaning the pipes, right? And then the next 20 minutes is usually where the gold is. So let's say I'm trying to figure out how do we grow this? How do we grow this? What I like doing is find a really inspiring place and you want something where you have an expansive view in front of you because then your mind feels expansive. Write down the problem you're facing. So let's say how do we grow 1000x, right? Then you just start journaling. And what happens is the first 5 minutes is just the stuff that you've been thinking about. And then you start making connections And then 30 minutes and you're what the fuck do I just write? And that's when you have to keep going. Just start writing what you're thinking as fast as possible. And at some point, synapses connect, brain networks form. And usually what I find is the last 20 minutes is where the gold is. where I just like figure out, oh, this is actually how I can easily resolve this. And also, like, this doesn't really apply to writing, right? So for example, Horia was the designer on our team. I remember there was a point where we were working either on a logo or a mark, and we just couldn't crack it. I was like, Horia, can you try this? Can you just take 60 minutes and just do different variations of the design and see what you come up with? And she came up with all these ideas, and that's where we found like the gold, because one of the later ones became the inspiration for what we ultimately used. The best creative ideas happen with other people. Let's say we're trying to solve an issue, right? I'm going to go back to actually what we were talking about with rondos and passing between each other, right? And so what happens is sometimes, let's say you're working on something and you're kind of like stuck, and you just like stay stuck. That's what a lot of people do. What I love doing is we actually have this thing called 20-80-100 in the way we operate, which is, let's say we come up with a task or whatever. What is the 20% of this that we can execute in 24 hours? Then let's take that to 80, and then let's take it to 100. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll just pass 20% back and forth, right? Or do it collectively, which is we're working on this logo. Let's say someone on the team like designs it, pass it to that person for feedback, then pass it back to the other person, and kind of like have this like fast movement, because then you're getting the ideas not just from one person, you're getting the ideas from everyone. And obviously the most ideal way to do this is like having everyone be in the same room. But if that's not something you can do, especially with remote work, working on something just up to 20%, and then keeping it there and passing back and forth between different people and getting everyone's ideas, I find works out way better than just me sitting in my desk and like trying to figure this out.